welcome back. I am Eudine Barriteau, Professor of Gender and Public Policy and lead organizer for the Gender and Development Forum. I am truly honored to moderate this panel of powerful Indigenous women examining the topic of rethinking sustainability, economy, and ecology from the perspectives of Indigenous knowledge and technologies. The UN and UNCTAD, as one of its principal institutions, are dedicated to achieving its 17 Sustainable Development Goals introduced in 2015 as the blueprint to achieving a better and more sustainable future for all by 2030. The Gender and Development Forum believes Indigenous knowledge and technologies are at the core of achieving a sustainable future for all. But what do we mean by Indigenous knowledge and technologies? What are the approaches, policies, and practices UNCTAD should promote in rethinking sustainable development? What recommendations can our experts make to UNCTAD to ensure economies, the environment, and the people benefit from harmonious relationships among people, our planet, and our techniques of producing? Our panel of experts will explore this. Our first presenter is Her Excellency Lady Froilan Salam, an author, activist, researcher, and first Indigenous woman to be appointed Governor General of Belize. Her Excellency is a Mopan Maya woman who strives to forge understanding and tolerance between the Indigenous and industrialized worlds. Our second presenter is Ms. Alice Rambukawa, and she's a climate activist and one of Fiji's leading ocean experts, tirelessly working to promote traditional, sustainable shipping and ocean protection. And now over to the panelists. Your Excellency, welcome, and I invite you to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I won't be 10 minutes, I'll be shorter. So let me start by saying, Josesh, Tulakalesh, Batikti, Kagmuch Anon, Takina Daihi, Kativila, Bikiti Dekesh Meyaha. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for seeing how we can all try to work together for our common purpose. The OAS and the United Nations theme for this year is Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous Peoples and the Call for a New Social Contract. In response to the pandemic, there is a global desire to go back to normal, but perhaps it is time to press the reset button and use this time as an opportunity to do things better, to give ourselves and the ecosystems we depend on a chance of survival given climate change. UNCTAD can support the renewal of the social contract between Indigenous peoples and their states by helping to develop policies that foster innovation, productivity, and environmental stewardship to create a more just and inclusive society. The Sustainable Development Goals are said to be based on 3 pillars: environmental protection, social sustainability, economic sustainability. With the creative economy being promoted globally, it can be argued that culture should also be included as a 4th pillar. However, 500 years of interaction has left us a history of taking by force, without permission. First, it was our lands and resources. Now, Indigenous knowledge systems are being examined to be used to help answer some of the global questions of climate change. Uncomfortable but ethical questions need to be addressed to build back the trust between Indigenous people and others to increase the resilience and adaptation of humans. We can foster trust if interested parties, states and corporations are respectful of Indigenous people's knowledge, which are not Narita's nullius, or no one's knowledge, to be appropriated, any more than our land was terra nullius in the 1500s. Acknowledging our unique systems is being respectful and mindful and validates our contribution to global solutions. The power imbalance meant that Indigenous voices were absent from the conversation for so long. The current context, by all accounts, of using the intellectual property framework is falling short of leaving no one behind if Indigenous peoples are being excluded. The rights of private property ownership in modern liberal democracies continues to be at odds with how Indigenous people own knowledge. Protecting this knowledge is as problematic as it was for the legal recognition and protection of communal ownership of land and resources. Our systems include cultural, historical, ethical, political, religious, spiritual, and moral dimensions that do not allow for easy translation into Western paradigms. In Belize, the Mopan Maya are looking at protecting their traditional designs from appropriation and to use the motifs in new designs to promote cultural attire. An economic model is also being pursued by some Kekchi Maya communities that is based on their natural resources to benefit their communities. These kinds of sustainable development promote cultural identity, territory, and therefore economic development. Based on the many challenges I face doing these two Maya-led and therefore Indigenous developments, I have the following recommendations. 1, it is clear there needs to be support at the state level for the protection of Indigenous people's knowledge systems. Free, prior, informed consent should be a guiding principle in the interaction between Indigenous people, the state, and third parties. The state should include legal support for communities to make and enforce those decisions. This will help to mitigate some of the inherent power imbalances that conversations around traditional knowledge present. This is particularly true for women's groups who are largely our cultural practitioners. They don't speak English and engage with the national economy on a very limited basis. It is by increasing their protection that they can truly be a part of any economic entrepreneurial program, whether it be local, national, or global. Number 2, protocols can be a way to develop a relationship with others and be the basis of negotiations while conventions are being developed. It needs to be participatory. International legal instruments can help define what is meant by traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, who the rights holders are, how competing claims by communities can be resolved, and what rights and exceptions are to apply. It is a huge burden for Indigenous people to research what currently exists. 3, research is needed to develop policies in partnership with Indigenous people to help bridge the gap between practice and policy that remain elusive despite the last decades witnessing the development of a wide range of methods. UNCTAD can support by researching practical applications to offer direct technical assistance to help countries build the capacities they need for equitable integration into the global economy and improve the well-being of their populations. Going forward, there may not be one law that fits all, but rather some that may be sui generis in community and local context base. The diversity of models is good for innovation and is good for resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. That is a very informed, analytical presentation. I'm looking forward to posing some questions to you. And now I would like to invite Alicia to share with us and our audience your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eudine, and thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Your Excellency. You've really expressed a lot of the things that we do share. But for my presentation, Your Excellency, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen, it's always an honor to have an opportunity to speak at an event such as this. When I was asked to share on this panel, my mind immediately went to what is known to be true for me as an Indigenous person of Fiji, a small island on the South Pacific Ocean. You know, for the Pacific, we consider ourselves large ocean states, and the ocean is our source of sustenance and income. We have lived on this island and lived off its resources for millennia. And when I think of what I would like to call in this conversation an indigenous model, thinking of balancing ecology, economics, and as Your Excellency had mentioned, also the inclusion of culture in these pillars. I feel that for my contribution, my piece, there is no need for me to reinvent the wheel. For us as Indigenous people, our environment, and for us in Fiji, the word is vanua. The deep respect for it is almost innate. The cultural relationship, the economic relationship, every part of it, even our human interactions, is very closely related with our environment. We have totems for fish, for birds, for plants, and all of these things represent this deep relationship that we have. And then when I think about a model that we can bring in, this is what I draw on. This is what I think of, that the important conversation we need to have, and it has been happening, but we need to push further and include these indigenous models. How do we make the economy a subset of the environment rather than extracting from the environment to suit this economic scale that we project? What are the processes that we can take? And something that I always think of is ecological accounting. How can we go out into environment and know what is in there, and then make a model of what would be sustainable for us to continuously use, in perpetuity? That is a component that is missing today when most of our extraction from the environment goes beyond what is sustainable, what is able to be sustained. And for me, when I was asked to speak, one concept that I wanted to share from our communities is called Sole Solevaki. And Sole Solevaki is an indigenous Fijian term, meaning when we work together, we work as a community to help each other. And it's something as simple as coming together to build someone's home and getting resources from the environment, to coming collectively to help with farming, with fishing. And these are simple examples because I wanted to first explain how it works in a community, and then how this model can be used exponentially. And for me, I feel like these traditional practices, this knowledge that has been used for millennia, that has been trialed and tested and proven and continues to exist in our communities, means that it is a functioning model that should be further, what's the word I'm looking for? That should be further explored, that should be invested in when we have this global conversation. And one other example I'd like to give, because my background is in marine science and it's probably my strength, and I wanted to bring in another practical example, is there is a community in Boa, a province in Fiji. It has 14 provinces, the province I'm from, this district, Kumbulau, in the 1980s, recognizing some of the threats of fisheries, the chiefs of the villages in this district came together in a Solevaki way and decided that they needed to protect their fishing grounds for future generations, not only for use of subsistence and fisheries, but also to find alternative means of income. And that was the starting process of what became one of the largest, one of the top diving sites in the world, called the Namena Marine Reserve. And it was a successful business model built on traditional practices, where they decided to have a traditional tambu, where they stopped fishing there. And they worked with the businesses there, the diving companies, the touristers, and they brought them together, and they would dive at this marine site. And so they would then sell these dive tags to people. And so all the money that was raised would go directly to the community to help with all of their socio-economic projects that they needed. And the reason I say was a successful model was because we were hit with a Category 5 cyclone in 2017. And that was Tropical Cyclone Winston. That was the first time it happened. And now I'm going into the topic of climate change. And when that cyclone hit, it devastated a large part of this marine reserve, and a lot of the tourist operators stopped working, and a lot of the incomes for communities lessened. And that brings us to another important conversation of the connectivity we have globally. And while we may have successful, brilliant models that work in our countries, for us in the Pacific, one of the key threats to all of this is always the issue of devastating cyclones and droughts and all these issues that have been exacerbated because of the impacts of climate change, because of global warming. And so that is an important conversation, an important connection that we'll always have. That yes, we have the answers, yes, we have the business models, but there's also an important conversation around climate change, around these global issues that are beyond what we are able to resolve, because we are at the front lines, but we're not the ones polluting the world. We're not the highest carbon emitters, and yet it is what impacts some of the great work that has been set in motion in our countries as great examples or gifts to the world of what Indigenous models, functioning Indigenous models can look like. And I really could go on, but I will stop my intervention there. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And again, thanks to both of you, because when I listen to you, I see the connections in that conversation. And if I could turn to Your Excellency first and ask you, when the UN has identified these 3 pillars of sustainable development that Alicia herself has mentioned, and you have asked that culture be added. And it is very interesting because the UN also has a special rapporteur on Indigenous people. And I think, in a sense, the whole issue of culture would be brought in there. But because culture is also understood differently in different settings in terms of sustainable development, I would like you to explore for me and our audience exactly what you mean by adding culture as a pillar for sustainable development, and show how Indigenous knowledge and technologies would enhance using that as a 4th pillar and would really enhance the work that we all want to achieve for sustainable development for all.
Thank you. Indeed, I have wrestled many times with these questions. For me, culture really comes down to the worldview that we have, how we interact with the natural environment, the language we use, the rituals that we practice, some of which Alicia was mentioning, this interaction with the physical environment. So what we have basically been saying as Indigenous people is that how we see the natural environment is fundamentally different to how Westerners view the environment. For us, the environment is an extension of ourselves in the sense that we must always try to maintain a balance for its well-being, because if the physical environment is taken care of, we are taken care of. And so I would like to speak on the extraction mode that we have been promoting. Really, we can say over the last 500 years, where there was an expansion of development into areas that had not been, been touched by Europeans. And so what that fundamentally meant is that whereas we were maintaining a balance with our natural environment because we needed it for our survival, the extractionist mode, one can argue, is kind of why we now have climate change hastened to the extent that it is now, where time is against us. So culture for me then is one of the pillars in terms of the infrastructure. Like I had said, language, the way we describe things, is based on our interactions, based on experience. So I think if we are to look at the answers or to look at solutions to the problems that we're facing, we must be more open to different ways of thinking, to different ways of being, and to different ways of doing. Because if not, it's almost like we're stuck in a box and we cannot escape. And so culture, especially Indigenous people's cultures, and I have to be very clear, even though we use the term Indigenous peoples to describe a group, really what it is there are so many diverse knowledge systems of Indigenous people. So even that alone, if we were to dissect that, we would not, it's not a binary discussion we're having with Indigenous and Western or Indigenous and other, because of the complexity of human cultures.
Yes.
So for us then, we need to go beyond just looking at culture for economic sustainability. That is important. We need to look at what worldviews we can bring to this discussion. So really, it's an open dialogue. It's one that's going to be very much diverse. And I think until we have multiple voices being present at the table, we will be stuck. It's like you have a book that you keep going to over and over again. And unless you have a different experience from the first time you read a book to when you go back and read it a 10th time, you're getting the same information, and you're not going to be able to fundamentally address the diverse issues, the very complex issues that we're facing with. But one thing is for certain, and I'm glad to hear that Alicia pointed this out, many times we are at the front line of the impact of something that started way before our time and that we have minimal, that we did not cause, but definitely we are feeling the impact. But now, especially this summer, I could see it beginning before the COVID pandemic last year, February. We had massive forest fires. Then we had this pandemic. This pandemic almost is a reaction of human beings going into ecosystems that they should not be at. And so we have to look at the interconnectedness of the global events to try come up with some global solutions. So that's what I mean by how we can use our culture to inform the other types of pillars that we have in order to really and truly have sustainable development.
Thank you very much. And again, the interconnectedness between what you are saying and what Alicia is saying is also very clear, because when Alicia was speaking and she mentioned the three pillars themselves, the UN, in terms of defining sustainable development, had spoken to ecology, economics, and society. And they speak of the environment, of production, of people. But I have also seen them reduce that to when they speak of ecology in, the planet. They speak of society's people. That's good. But what I was a little perturbed at is that when they spoke of the economics, they spoke of profit. And the understanding of economics as profit immediately became problematic. And I read it in a UN document. And Alicia quite clearly pointed out that we should not see the environment should not be seen as a subset of the economy, but rather the other way around. And again, in terms of what this forum could bring to UNCTAD and to bring to the world a greater understanding of Indigenous knowledge frameworks. I like your point, Alicia, and I want you to expand on it about ecological accounting, because that you had spoken about the need to look at ecological accounting, and I want to come back to you again about, I can't get the correct pronunciation, but it starts with solar, because there are systems like that in the Caribbean, in the southern and eastern Caribbean, and I'm sure there exists that in Belize among the Mayan people and the others, the Garifuna and others. But first, Alicia, if you could expand on that. And immediately, the connection would be, in terms of what Her Excellency is offering us, you put culture there as a fourth pillar. And culture is a worldview, is a respect for the systems of knowledge. And we go to what I would ask you to explore, because I know you will see it as problematic to see economics as profit, production as profit. There's a respect for the planet, there's a respect for people, but economics is profit, and then to move to expanding on your statement about ecological accounting.
Thank you, Eudine. Yes, economics for profit will always be problematic. I agree, because our resources are finite, or they can only reproduce at a certain rate. And I'm talking about basic things. We can understand how fast trees grow, how long it takes for a fish to fully mature, a turtle, a whale, and so these are the basic things that we need to account for first. When we're trying to say that we will have X tonnage of fish exported in a year, do we know, can we at least try and have a way to figure out how much fish we really do have, at what size and stage of growth of this fish? And is it really feasible that we will be able to go out and extract and export X tonnage of fish for, in order for income to come into the country, for people, and to feed people as well. And at most times, it's the other way around, Like what I said, the environment is always a subset of the economy. We place a target here for and this is not my area of expertise, I may say things wrong, like for our GDP, we place it up here. And then we start extracting from the environment, extracting to try and hit this target, and not really checking how much is in the environment and how much can be met. And are we really extracting sustainably, or to the point where we will have what we call, I'm sorry, this morning I seem to be losing words, when we lose out on species because they're extracted to the point that they cannot reproduce. And that's really it in its most basic explanation. When we're cutting trees, why do we need to cut down the trees? Okay, we're building homes, we're building businesses, we're building roads, we're doing all of this development, but then it needs to be connected. And when we're talking about the environment being a subset of the economy, we also need to be thinking about a circular economy where resources are tapped into and used and it comes back right around, rather than a linear economy where things just come from one end to here. And indigenous models look at the world this way. They look at our environment in this way. When you think about sole vaki is the word I was using. That's the concept that we have, and you probably have this. I know you have the same. We as a community will agree. Okay, let's take a family, because I think the family is always the best example to use. There's a new family being formed. There's a couple getting married, and so what do they need in order for their family to live and prosper? They will need a home, they will need a farm, they will need the things to put inside their house, they will need, the mats and all these other things that are important for us. And so the community will come together and they will go out and they will get these things from, the environment, like the traditional ground. They'll go and say, okay, we will use these trees to build a home, we will bring these things, and they will collect it over time until the day that they would get married, and everyone would bring it together and collectively as a community using their resources around them and planning it out, because trees get planted for purposes, farms get done for purposes, and then it all comes back around, and then they use it, and then their family starts. And then when it goes on to another person, and they begin the process again in this beautiful circular way where it continues to move sustainably. Yeah? And I believe there's always beauty in poetry in the way we move and work in the environment. And that is exactly the same thing. And so when we take it to national and global levels, having that same frame of thinking, like Your Excellency had mentioned, if you're not extending your views, you won't learn a new message from reading the same book over and over again. You have to see something, go and have an experience, come back, and the message shifts. That resonated with me. And we need to take that out into the nationally and globally as well, the same concept of what do we need, and it shifts in how we think and what is needed in our economy, what is needed in our environment, what is needed by our people, and how can we work in a way that continues to move in this circular motion that, is sustainable. That's probably how I could best explain it right now.
Oh, that was again excellent, and again the connections. In fact, what I would want to extract right now are two key points you have offered us in the forum. The first, again, to Her Excellency, is the idea that culture must become a fourth pillar in speaking about sustainable development, and that when we put culture as the fourth pillar, we move away from what Alicia described as putting the economy up here as the Godhead and everything else flows. And that, Alicia, specific to you, I think the key point that you have offered us is that the economy is a subset of the environment and not the other way around. In other words, we must respect the environment. We have met it. It will help us to sustain ourselves, and we will leave the environment. And if we don't respect it, we see the effect in climate change. And in fact, the COVID pandemic is a wake-up call. Because what has happened during the pandemic, it has forced us to rely on what we could call indigenous ways of surviving, when what has become traditional ways of doing things have ground to halt, but really very modern ways, we have resorted to indigenous ways. And that I love the example of saying that by the end of this year, we are going to export X tons of fish, when we don't know, we are disrespecting the natural cycles of life. And that if our development is to be sustainable, we must have respect for that. And one of the reasons we disrespect it is because we put economics on a pillar. We put economics as the most important thing. And what we are saying here collectively to UNCTAD is that we cannot speak of the economy, ecology, and society as equal. And then when we try to understand it, we say the ecology is the environment and the planet, society is people, but economics is production for profit, because that changes the equation. And if we bring culture in, then culture will keep us centered, because it is the understanding that we are respecting indigenous worldviews and traditions. And I'll ask both of you to expand on what Alicia has raised as sola vaki, which in the Caribbean, in the Francophone Caribbean is Kudme. In Grenada and other countries, we call it maroon. Her Excellency is going to tell me what it is called in Belize, but the idea of communities coming together to help each other, to do things. Now, certainly when I was a child in Grenada in a rural area, if somebody wanted to build a house, the women of the family that would build the house, they would come together and cook a lot of food, a lot of food. And the men of the community would come, the women and men, and at the end of the day, this wooden house would be erected, and it would be an exchange for a meal. I am no longer in that country, but I don't think it happens anymore, because these things are seen, what served communities are seen as if, well, that belonged to the past, and the value of it no longer matters. So when you talk about the two models, Alicia, that particular model and also the successful business model that was halted by the cyclone, how can we advise UNCTAD that these things are not to be seen as traditional, but that we must respect whether it is that form of construction or a particular business model, whatever is indigenous, that we respect that cycle of living in harmony with the environment. What can we say to UNCTAD in terms of wanting developing countries to break out of these cycles of degradation, of exploitation and extraction in the economy. So if both of you, anyone, could speak to how we can do that, because I think we have the respect for that. But it is the understanding that I'm sure in many of Caribbean societies, those practices are seen as what the old people did. And now it is very modern, when we know it sustained us. Anyone? Your Excellency, you want to dive in? Well, at least tell us if this exists in Belize, which I'm sure it
Absolutely.
does. Yes. All
it
right.
does. And definitely we hear people talking about back in the day, but I can tell you that back in the day, in definitely the Maya and to some extent the Garifuna communities, is still what happens today. We use a Spanish word for the reciprocity of labor. So as Alisa had mentioned, a couple are going to get married. In this case, what happens is when we prepare the fields, you normally have a work group of about 10 families that join together, and each day, one person will take all the 10 and have that team clear their land. So within 10 days, all of them will have a sizable amount to help them for their corn or their rice or whatever it is they're going to plant. Then each of them has an obligation to return that day labor. So that happens for farming, that happens in terms of the clearing, the planting, and the harvesting. It's a sense of community, and I think that is a part of the culture of Indigenous people that I think is at odds with Western societies. Because if you look at it, Western societies promote the individual over everything else. And I think we can look at some countries where the right not to be vaccinated is at odds with this pandemic, which, I mean, I don't want to go into the argument, but it goes back to the value of the community, that as individuals, we belong to a larger social group, and whatever harm I do to them is going to come back to me. So I think that culture is something that's still very much alive in definitely Southern Belize. One of the issues, and I think this is a bigger problem with globalization and Western education that we have been receiving all our lives, is that in order to be successful, in order to be no longer traditional, we must leave all of that behind and move out of the rural areas or move out of a traditional system of livelihood, which is fundamentally based on you cannot take more than what you can use, either for yourself or your family. You cannot clear more forest than what you can farm. So there is that balance maintained because it comes down to your labor, basically. Now, we're having massive problems now because we're being told that that system is so primordial and has no relevance for modern living. But just to use this pandemic as an example, like I said before, there are clear indications that this close interaction between humans and their ecosystem upsets the balance, where you have predators being hunted out and allows certain vermins or unchecked populations to start invade. Australia, we saw them being invaded by the rats. So we don't have to look far to see where the imbalance occurs because of this individual pursuit of happiness. That, again, until we start questioning why is it that must be the only value that we should pursue when it has led to great harm to societies, to cultures, and now to the world. So I think there has to be a reconnection that those values that we have associated with the past are still very much relevant to our lives today. And that if we continue on this path, we are going to inherit a global ecosystem that is broken. And as a result, Homo sapiens, the age of the Anthropocene, will be something of the past, because my firm belief is that the world will survive. The question is, will human beings survive? And if so, which of the humans are going to survive because of the power imbalance that we have in this pursuit of the individual over everything else? So we have to find a way for UNCTAD to bring in these diverse voices from the state, from civil society, from Indigenous people, from Western cultures, to say that the clock is ticking and the time to mitigate has gone. It's an adaptation. I mean, my heart goes out when you look at the islands that are disappearing, shorelines are going to disappear. So this is an existential threat that is going to happen. And unless we do the same thing that we did for the pandemic, we have to put in emergency measures. And until we do that, we will not have much of a future to look at. And certainly not with fossil fuel still being maintained at the levels that they are. It seems to be that we know we are boiling and we're unable to put out the fire. And in so doing, we will all collapse as a system. That is my firm belief.
Thank you very much. Alicia, I see you nodding your head so much. I just want to invite you to comment. I am so enjoying your presentations that I'm getting involved. I want to just go to you without saying anything else.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. There's so many points you raised, and I was just like, yes. When you pointed out the issue of the infestations of vermin in Australia, it also reminded me of the forest fires that happened in Australia, and how the Aboriginal people of Australia have these practices of bush burning that helps to maintain the environment so that wildfires like this don't happen. And because that is not recognized, was not recognized and was not practiced anymore, it led to this devastating fire that was felt almost right across the world. And so we could spend all day giving example after example of how Indigenous knowledge and practices have worked or have stepped in situations in crisis times like this, where they have brought a solution. And sometimes it frustrates me because I feel like we continuously are burdened with having to prove that it works. We're constantly burdened with having to prove that it's valid. And by it, I mean Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices, Indigenous technology. And when I say Indigenous technology, I want to give the example of traditional sailing canoes. I was part of this project as well, where they built these large double-hulled canoes and sailed, right across the world to prove that these sailing methods still work 100% sustainable using wind. And there was also solar, because we are not afraid to integrate technology, because we have to recognize when we're talking about Indigenous technology, we're not just talking about rubbing sticks together to make fire. There is ingenuity in our technology. We're talking about our architects, our engineers that have built amazing prototypes of boats, of buildings, of how to make these islands, how to build up islands even, the technology to understand which levels of soil go one on top of the other. And I'm just throwing out different examples of Indigenous knowledge of technology that we have, and it has a place. And I also want to reiterate what Her Excellency said, that we need to broaden our vision. There's not just one way of looking at things. And I also loved how she talked about the diversity, because even for us, we're a population of maybe 900,000 people on about 300 islands here in Fiji, and we have over 1,000 different villages, which means, and we are not a monolith. Like, there are differences in our cultural practices, our dialects, our languages, our processes, how we interact, our relationships, and all of that in this small island works and functions together. And imagine if we are able to amplify that globally, that we do not look at the world in just one way, that we recognize all the different types of cultures and ways of being and living and help to integrate it to work together? And the answer is all around us. In Indigenous communities, when you look at the way they work and they live and practice, and I said it in the beginning, I'll say it again, and these are practices that have worked for millennia, tried, tested, and true, and continue to live to this day. And I don't have the specific words of intervention for UNCTAD to tell them, you know, what they should do, but they really need to just break open that tunnel vision and just look at the world for how it really is. And we are all here, we all exist in the present, and we need to be recognized as well.
Thank you, Alicia. I want to remind you and Your Excellency about how much you have told us. And in telling us here this afternoon, you are really telling UNCTAD and the world. If I can build on what Her Excellency has said, we are boiling and we continue to boil. You know, almost literally, we continue to boil because we are committed to profits. And I mean, it is quite, I am so pleased on behalf of the forum that you have pulled on an analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic, because that pandemic has removed the scab and shown us where we are and the simultaneous crises that we are experiencing. If the pandemic first introduced a health crisis, it quickly led to an economic crisis because we had to shut down, planes had to stop flying, ships traversing the ocean. But how good was that for the environment? I mean, I remember last year seeing pictures of, I won't name countries, but pictures before the pandemic and the pictures after the pandemic, and you were seeing the blue skies. So there was some sort of overuse. We know that we were using the planet in an awful manner. But again, the pandemic actually exacerbated the reality of that, showing us that reality. And then we have, we currently are experiencing ecological crisis. In countries that normally have very cold weather, they're having temperatures of 40 degrees now. In countries that never had flooding, there is widespread flooding, or if they had it, it was once in a while. Forest fires are raging in other countries. In the Caribbean, we get hurricanes, and it seems as if they're coming more rapidly. In the Pacific area, you have cyclones and typhoons, and they're coming more rapidly. The planet, the Earth, is trying to say something to us. And as Her Excellency has said, whether we listen or not, the Earth is going to be here. It is going to throw off these generations, but the Earth is going to be here. So I think that you have offered us some really very, very critical points that we need to take forward. We cannot remain committed to the extractive model. We have to respect the environment. We have to think of the economy as more circular rather than linear. And again, I think the big crisis is the fact, or the big exposure, is the limitation of the neoliberal approach to development, this commitment to that approach, that it is not stated, but it is what drives everything. So we say nice words and we speak the platitudes, but at the end of the day, it is all profit. If we have to grow chicken under lights for 6 weeks to make them big for the market, that is what we do. And this is the crisis, I think the collectivity of the various crises that we are seeing, that this panel is saying to UNCTAD, we have to have greater respect for indigenous ways of doing things. Her Excellency, and I'm going to let this be the last one and invite both of you, when she put out her 3 recommendations, started with the role of the state and countries. UNCTAD is made up of member countries. Our countries are members of UNCTAD, and the GG is located in a very interesting manner because, I mean, we have a Governor General, a head of state, who thinks very carefully and in a very hard, clear manner about the role of the state and what it is saying to our member countries and what we collectively have to say to our member countries. So I'd invite you to have a closing comment on this, but I want to say that this has been extremely, extremely informative. Has brought new knowledge to the surface for a lot who wouldn't have thought about it in this manner. And I know that our audience will have questions for you. But before we get to that, I would like to invite you to speak on the role of the state. Again, I will start with Her Excellency and then come to you, Alici.
Thank you. I think this pandemic and climate change crisis really, to my mind, is a time to revisit the social contracts that states have with their citizens. And I believe that it seems to me that we are no longer talking together, and the dual crisis that we're experiencing is an opportunity for us to revisit. We talk about profits, but the question is, who is benefiting from these profits when the social contract that depends on taxations for the states to deliver on their health services and education, they need a source of revenue. And it seems to me that they are no longer able to collect taxation as they were able to, like, say, 50 years ago. And we see some countries really struggling to fulfill their social contract obligations. So it is critical then that from a governance perspective, if we're talking about a rights-based approach, we must bring in diverse voices to have these discussions, because decisions are being made. And if we're not participating, if we don't demand to be at the table, then those decisions will be made, and there's going to be a very strong, potentially negative impact on everyone's lives. And it's not that I'm promoting one system over another, but it really is to look at the social contract that used to be, that is embedded in the case of Belize very strongly in its constitution. And I have to say that listening to other states doing presentations earlier this week, it really struck me that because Belize is a relatively young democracy, our constitution has many rights embedded that other older countries are having to revisit their constitution to see how they can, for instance, be more inclusive of Indigenous people's rights, for instance. So I think if there's any takeaway for me, it is we must use what is happening as an opportunity to revisit what we have today and to clearly ask those questions if we're going to continue like this, or are we going to really talk about human rights and see how we can address some of the shortcomings of the social contract that currently exists. That's pretty much it for me.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Alici?
I think for me, I'm coming from the other end of the conversation, you know, as a citizen, and the concerns that because of the economic downturn, because of, you know, all the obligations and all the things that need to be met by our government, how much more disenfranchised will we become? How much, you know, how much more less of a priority in a sense, because at times we see our indigeneity and our communal identity weaponized, and it's concerning, and weaponized in the sense that because for us in Fiji and most Pacific Island countries, our indigenous communities are the majority of the population, and because we are in positions of power within local and national level, and because of all these other criteria, we do not necessarily fit into a definition of indigenous peoples, like a global definition that has been given that identifies them as minority, you know, not in decision-making roles. But speaking for indigenous communities in Fiji, we have this land tenureship system that says that we're landowners, but if you really look at it, what we really are just the gatekeepers. And because of that, we're often seen as more privileged, but we do not have socioeconomic privilege. You know, if you take away the ability to plant and to sell on the land, because that's mostly what it's used for, or in our case, tourism, which is like the highest economic earner that's just closed. There isn't much else. And what I keep thinking back is how much more would be taken and extracted from us using for the sake of the community or for the sake of Fiji, without respecting community rights, free, prior, informed consent, all these processes, for the benefit of the economy and extraction, because that's just the reality, that bills got to be paid, whether it's for the house or it's for the country, and how those bills get paid, who stands back, that's often us. And my probably final closing message is that because of COVID and how economies and countries globally have been impacted, my hope is that Indigenous communities do not become further marginalized, Indigenous women, that we do not become further marginalized in the process of trying to recover, and that there needs to be a better way that we can recover in the ways that we have already discussed in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adding diverse voices, adding culture as a fourth pillar of sustainable development, ensuring respect for the environment, ensuring respect and use of Indigenous technologies and models, holding states accountable, avoiding marginalization of Indigenous communities. These are just some of the very critical points our distinguished panel has offered us. Thank you. And again, thank you to our panel.